Hi everybody, I'm Dave Gilchrist. I work at Bookmarks. I'm tonight to introduce this Bookmarks event. We've got Michael Lavalette, who's speaking on his new book, Palestine Cultures of Resistance. Michael is the author of several books. A previous book on Palestine called Voices from the West Bank that came out a few years ago, and also several books on social work. Mike's going to talk to us for about 20 minutes, half an hour, show some slides, a little bit of clip, and then we'll have time for questions and contributions as normal. Obviously, this is coming now at a very important time. A ceasefire has been declared by the Israeli state after their attacks on Gaza. But at the same time, as there seems to be a new uprising, a new intifada in Palestine, where people from all the separate parts of Palestine, separated by Zionism, have come together to resist and protest, whether it's in the West Bank, in Gaza, or in Israel 48, the Palestinians that are inside what is Israel. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and things, but what Mike is going to talk about is how really one a key aspect of Palestinian culture and how that culture has created a united identity, has kept people together in the diaspora and all the different in the camps and so on, and how important that has been to the resistance and the struggle. So really, I'm just going to hand you over to Michael, and then you can put your questions and any comments you have in the chat, which we'll have time for at the end. So over to you, Michael. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dave. First of all, thanks to Bookmarks and thanks to Red Words for sticking with us. This is a book that's been about 3 years in the making. Its background was in my last trip to the West Bank, which was 3 years ago. I take regular field trips to the West Bank with students, and we go to various different places. We go to the Museum of Mahmoud Darwish. We go to the National Museum. Both of those are in Ramallah. We go to the university in Najaf, where the library is named after Ghassan Kanafani. And students and people that I was with the last time said, "Well, why don't you write something about Mahmoud Darwish and Gassan Canifani?" And so the idea was born out of those trips. And I came back and spoke to Dave and Roger at Red Words, and they agreed that we would try and put this book together. I think they thought it was going to be here a fair few months, if not years, before it was. But anyway, it's now ready for publication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take through some of the themes in the book, and I'm going to concentrate on one of the artists itself. So I've got some slides so that you're not just staring at myself. So I think Dave's going to do that. I'm going to put some PowerPoint slides up. I'm going to talk through those, and I've also got a little bit of a clip from Gassan Canifani. So that's actually my third slide. So we're just going to go to the beginning. There we go. As I said, that's the background to the book. But the book tries to look. I suppose it's a different way of looking at Palestinian history. So it tries to cover the main points of Palestinian history in the last 100 years. And in the process, it does through the poetry, the novels, the cartoons of some of the main cultural figures who are, I suppose, Palestinian icons of what's sometimes called the classical Palestinian era of national resistance art, which is a period that takes us from 1967, from the Nakba of 1967. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, through to the early 1990s, to the signing of the Oslo Accords. And that classical period of national resistance art is crammed full of really important debates that take place in the Palestinian diaspora, amongst Palestinian political organisations. And I've tried to flesh those things out as we're talking about the four main artists that I talk about. So who are the four main artists? First of all, Mahmoud Darwish. Darwish is probably known to be the national poet of Palestine. And we've got a couple of chapters on him because his life is really divided into two. For the first part of his life, he is within Palestine 48, or Israel. He was born in a village called Burway, and then in 1948, him and his family were ethnically cleansed from Burway, and he moved to Lebanon. He was in Lebanon for 12 months, and then him and his family smuggled their way back in to Palestine. But in the intervening period, the Israelis had conducted a census. And so from that point on, Mahmoud Darwish and his immediate family were known as present absentee aliens. A really awkward way of referring to anybody, but you can get some understanding of how the Israelis classify people. So he wasn't classified as a refugee. He wasn't classified as a Palestinian or Israeli Arab. He was a present absentee alien, is how they talked about him. So he grew up in Palestine 48. His early poetry is shaped by the experience of Palestinians in Palestine 48 in that period. But then in 1970, he moves he leaves Palestine 48. He goes first to Russia and then on to Lebanon. And so there's a second chapter which looks at his life in Lebanon, where he becomes very close to the leadership of the PLO, and at that point almost becomes the poet of the PLO. So we trace that through, and we trace the second half of his life, if you like, being a Palestinian of the exterior as opposed to a Palestinian of the interior, which is the first part of his artistic or cultural production. The second person the book covers is a woman called Fadwa Tokan. Fadwa Tokan was born and brought up in Nablus, which meant that she or her family didn't suffer the immediate effects of the Nakba of 1948. Nablus was in the West Bank. The people of Nablus, supported by the Iraqi brigade, actually defended the town in 48 from the Israeli forces, pushed them back, and so Nablus was never captured in 1948, but of course Nablus then did become part of Jordan. So it was part of Jordan, but it does become part of Palestine 48, or Israel, after the Nakba of 1967, when after the 6-Day War, the Israelis push into the West Bank and take the West Bank. Fadwa Tokan is the sister of Ibrahim Tokan, and Ibrahim Tokan is known as one of the great nationalist poets of the pre-war period. But Fadwa, there was ever a badge of honor that came from Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, who said that every time that Fadwa Tokan writes a poem, another 20 people join the resistance forces. So that's some accolade, in my opinion. The third person that the book covers is the graphic artist Naji Al-Ali. Now, Naji Al-Ali is a cartoonist, and amongst other things, he is most famous for the cartoon character Handala. So if you look on the book cover, in the middle of the book cover, there is a small picture of Handala. And Handala appeared in all of Naji Al-Ali's cartoons from 1970 onwards. On a few occasions you saw him face on, but the vast majority of the time he's turned his back away from the viewer. He's turned his back on the pain of Palestine, is what Naji Al-Ali said. And he is there as a witness to the crimes and horrors inflicted on the Palestinian people. Naji Al-Ali was a Palestinian who lived in the Galilee, but he was ethnically cleansed in 1948. Him and his family, they lived in refugee camp in Lebanon. And Handala is a 12-year-old boy stuck at the age of 12, and that is the age that Naji was when he and his family were cleansed during the Nakba. And the fourth person that we talk about is Ghassan Kanafani, and that's the person who I'm going to speak most about today. I thought rather than do the full book, I would focus on one of the writers. Perhaps I'm chancing my arm, but then I thought that means that Dave has to ask me on to do another one about Naji Al-Ali, another one about Fadwa Tokan, and another one about Mahmoud Darwish. So we're going to concentrate mainly about Ghassan Kanafani, and I'll tell you a little bit more about his story. But together, the four artists, I think, tell us about the Palestinian. They give voice to the Palestinian people. They, in their own ways, depict the trauma of refugee life in exile. They reflect the horrors of occupation and brutal oppression, and they celebrate the heroism of the Palestinian resistance. And obviously, at this point in our time, this week, these are things I think that we should be celebrating as well. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that these are not historic figures, but the poetry, the short stories, the novels, the cartoon characters, the drawings of these artists continue to speak of the Palestinian liberation struggle today. So Dave, if you could put on my next slide. So this is Ghassan Kanafani, and Gassan Canifani was an artist. So if you know if you've ever seen the symbol of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that was designed by Ghassan Kanafani. He was an editor of numerous newspapers and monthly magazines. He was a political theorist. He was a historian. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. He was a cultural theorist, and he was a novelist and a short story writer. And it's the novels and short stories that we're going to look a little bit about today. And here's a quote from him. He says, "Insofar as I'm concerned, politics and the novel are an indivisible case. And I can categorically state that I became politically committed because I'm a novelist and not the opposite." So what I'd like to do just first of all is I'd like to just play a little clip. It's only 1 minute 40 seconds. And it's from an interview that Ghassan Kanafani did with the Australian Broadcast Company in 1970. But I thought it'd be useful because it shows somebody who's, in the face of questioning, he's absolutely steadfast on his commitment to the liberation struggle. But it also allows you to hear a little bit from the man and hear his distinctive voice, and then we'll come back and fill in a little bit of his history. So Dave, if you could put that on, we can then play that clip. And does that mean it's me that has to do that? Let me.
Yeah, you have to.
I'll do that. Okay, apologies. Here we go.
Why won't your organisation engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks. You mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there are no swords and no guns in the room, you can still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
For what? Or talk about stop fighting why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights is something as essential as life itself.
So, if I come back, that's me. Okay, so if we can go back onto the slides, I just thought it was useful to hear that. I think that's a fantastic quote or little clip. As I say, it was from the Australian Broadcast Company and their interview with Ghassan Kanafani in 1970. Dave, could we move on one slide again, please?
Yeah, sure.
So, who was he? This is my most cramped slide, I promise, but I just thought I'd put a little bit on so that we've got some detail here. So he was born in Accra on the 9th of April 1936. Accra is just across Haifa Bay from Haifa itself in the Galilee, and he was born into a comfortably well-off middle-class Arab family. Until the age of 12, he was educated at a French school in the city, and his birth in 1936 coincided with the Great Palestinian Revolt. So from 1936 to 1939, there is something that the Arabs or the Palestinians called Al-Thawra Al-Kubra, which is the Great Revolt. And it was the most significant uprising against the British Empire in the interwar years, put down in the most brutal way by the British. The RAF gassed Palestinians. 20,000 British troops were moved against the Palestinians. The Jewish settlers were used as militias by the British to control the Palestinian population at that time. That lasted for 3 years. And Kanafani's family were not directly involved in the fighting, but they were involved in the support movements and providing legal support and various other forms of support for those that were arrested. In Accra, where he lived, approximately 100 Palestinians were hung in Accra prison during that time. And in later life, Kanafani would go on to write the first really significant history of the revolt. And he identifies 3 problems that confront the Palestinian resistance. And he continued to argue that they started in 1936, but they continued to confront the Palestinian resistance right the way through his life. And I would argue that they continue to be the problems that confront the Palestinian resistance today. He said that they have to confront, first of all, imperialism, British imperialism in 36, 39, American imperialism today. They have to confront the colonial settlement by the Israelis. That was then, that continues to be the case today. And the third one, he said, was that there was the problem of a quisling Arab elite, either in other Arab states or within Palestine, who were far too quick to make alliances both with empire and with settlers at the expense of ordinary Palestinians. So he argued that in 1968 in his history of 36 to 39, with a view to the continuing problems today. 1948, on his 12th birthday, so the 9th of April 1948, is also marks the day in which the destruction of the village of Deir Yassin took place. And Deir Yassin is about 10 miles from Jerusalem, and in 1948, a number of future Israeli armed forces, so the Irgun, the Stern Gang, Haganah, moved into Deir Yassin. They destroyed homes, mosques, schools, and slaughtered close to 200 Palestinians, children, men, women, and the elderly. Again, Menachem Begin would later say that the events at Deir Yassin allowed the Jewish forces to cut like a hot knife through butter through the Arab villages in the Jerusalem area in 1948. And Anna Kanafani, Ghassan's wife, tells us that after his 12th birthday, Ghassan Kanafani refused to celebrate on his birthday because for him it was always indelibly marked with the events of Deir Yassin in 1948. A month after Deir Yassin, the Haganah and the Kameli Brigade had been notorious for their ethnic cleansing of Haifa, but both the Haganah and the Kameli moved against Accra. And they used biological warfare against the population in the city. They poisoned the Cabri Springs, put typhoid in it, and it caused the disease to spread. They tried to claim that this was due to overcrowding and poverty in Accra, but it's interesting to note that 50 British soldiers who were in Accra at the time had to be hospitalised because of the poisoned waters. As a result of that, the Kameli Brigade were blasting out announcements telling people to flee Accra, to commit suicide, or to face the consequences. And faced with that, large numbers of the population of Accra fled, including Kanafani and his family. First to Lebanon, and then on to Syria. And he lived for the rest of his early life around Damascus. He becomes a teacher at the UNRWA school after completing his own education. And there he identifies 2 events which he says brings to his attention the social element of the Palestinian struggle. And that was that he was in school and he said that he noticed that young people kept on falling asleep in his class. You know, I suppose that might even have happened to me and Dave in our role as teachers or lecturers. But he looked at this and he said, this wasn't because I was a bad teacher, he said, but when I investigated, this was because the young people were working early in the morning and late at night because the few coppers that they brought in were essential for families to try and survive in the desperate circumstances of the refugee camps in the 50s in Syria, around Damascus. And the second thing he said was that in an art lesson in class, he asked the pupils to draw an apple and a banana, and they couldn't because they'd never seen an apple or a banana. Now that's kind of shocking for us today, but if you've ever been to Palestine, it becomes even more astonishing, because Palestine is an incredibly rich agricultural place. That, you know, when, you know, if you go to Tesco's or Sainsbury's or wherever it is that you go and do your shopping, and then you suddenly go to Palestine, you suddenly realise that in Palestine today, the apples, the bananas, the courgettes, they're all about 5 times the size of anything you've ever seen at Tesco's. It's just an astonishing thing, and they're there. They manage to have several crops of these things. So for Kanafani, the fact that Palestinian children had never seen apples and bananas was yet again an indication of the social cost of what the refugee and the Nakba and what that actually meant. So this moves him, and he starts to think not only about Palestinian liberation, but also essentially the plight of the Palestinian poor and the Palestinian refugees. He combines his teaching with a spell at Damascus University, and there he meets George Habash. And George Habash at the time is the leader of the Arab nationalist movement, which is a pan-Arabist movement. And he then is a confidant of Habash for the rest of his life. And follows Habash as an Arab nationalist in the 50s, and then up to the mid-60s, the pool of Arab nationalism was particularly strong amongst the refugee communities. It looked as if the Palestinian leadership had been smashed. The Palestinian population was spread across the Middle East. But in place of that, there was strong leaders in Nasser in Egypt, or in the leadership in Syria. And for pan-Arabist politicians, the liberation of Palestine would come through the armed forces of Syria and Egypt and maybe even Jordan. And that was the way to think about Palestinian liberation. So the Arab nationalist movement was one that focused on the other Arab countries bringing about the liberation of Palestine. And the Kanafani is a part of the Arab nationalist movement in the 50s through to the early 1960s in that way. From 55 to 60, he then moves to Kuwait, and it's there that he starts writing his short stories. And he talks about two, The Land of Sad, well, I'm going to talk about two, The Land of Sad Oranges and Letter from Gaza. So Dave, again, if you could just flick on to the next slide. So Kanafani in these early years, I think his task, if you like, is to reclaim Palestine. That's the place. They actually say that there is a place, Palestine, as it's now called Israel. So to reclaim that, and also to raise awareness of the plight of Palestinian refugees. And I think he does this fantastically well in these two short stories. So The Land of Sad Oranges, the land of sad oranges, if you like, that is Palestine. And he is reclaiming this absent place. And he tells a story which, in the early part of it, is really quite autobiographical. So it talks about Accra and a family forced to flee and coming to the checkpoint to get to Beirut. And he writes this as a small child. So the small child, it's quite exciting at first to be putting all your belongings in the back of a truck and then, you know, putting the truck and going somewhere else. But gradually, as they get to the checkpoint, the realization on the child and his family of what refugeedom actually means becomes clear. And at the checkpoint, they are looking around and there's a seller selling oranges. And this is the thing which throws the family into complete grief, because they suddenly realize that their orange groves, their crops, these are now being taken over by Israelis, and that they will not have the right very easily to return and to take them. So the oranges become sad oranges, but they become about home and place in that way. And then the rest of the story, I don't want to have too many spoilers, but the rest of the story, it's a relatively short story, but it tells what happens in the first few weeks of being refugees and without place, and the trauma, its impact, psychological impact it has on everybody, the particular impact it has on the child's father, who contemplates both killing his children because he sees no future, and also taking his own life. And at the end, he is lying in his bed contemplating what to do, and he notes or sees the oranges that he got at the checkpoint have now shriveled, are unappetizing, and it's a sort of remembrance of what Palestine has become. So it's a really powerful short story, really, very accessible, and I think really important in actually trying to establish in 55 that there is a place called, there is a place of Palestine, and it has a right for people to have the right to return and to reclaim their place. The second one is the letter from Gaza, and the letter from Gaza is now widely available, so you can get it by going onto the Marxist Internet Archive. And if we've got time later on, we might show a clip of that from John Berger, who's reading that. And if we don't have time today, at the very end of the meeting, I do recommend that you go onto YouTube or another one of the other mediums and just type in John Berger reads Letter to Gaza, and it is the most moving reading. It takes about 14-15 minutes. And by the end, John Berger is close to tears as he's reading this story. So the letter to Gaza is a debate between a writer of a letter who you never know his name and his friend Mustafa, who've been brought up in Gaza, who have moved to Kuwait to be teachers, and who are faced with that dilemma. Do I go back to Gaza? Do I live as a refugee? Or do I move to America, where they've both been offered jobs, to think about a better life and freedom of movement and all the promises of what America, at least in theory, is meant to be? And so the letter writer confirms with Mustafa that he will soon join him in Sacramento, and he goes back to Gaza for a short holiday to say cheerio to his family. And when he arrives in Gaza, he, the story flips back and forward between the present and that, and so it gives you some grasp of what Gaza is like and the horrors of being in the refugee camps in Gaza. And this is in 55. This isn't in 2021, but this is in 1955. So he does that, and he's about to leave when his sister-in-law asks him to come to the hospital to see his niece Nadia. So he goes to the hospital, he goes to see Nadia, and when he arrives in the hospital, Nadia is elated to see him. She hugs him and she asks him, did he bring the presents that he promised from Kuwait? And he hasn't, he's forgotten, but he says he has. And he says, and in particular, I bought you those beautiful red trousers that you asked me to get you. And at that point in the letter, at that point in the story, there is a palpable silence. And then Nadia takes the covers from the bed back and points to the place where her leg used to be. And the rest of the story is Nadia's story. And Nadia lost her leg because when they were being attacked by the Israelis, she threw herself to protect her brothers, her younger brothers. And in the process of doing that, she lost a leg. And it's amputated from the top of the thigh. And this story then becomes one about, well, what are our responsibilities? And by telling that story, the author then comes to the conclusion that it would be selfish, it would be wrong, it would be individualistic to go to America. And instead, what he asks is for Mustafa to join him back in Gaza and to be part of the community and part of the fight for Palestine. So it's a wonderful short story, and if we've got time, it's read fantastically well from John Berger. But those really, I think, are part of him giving voice to the refugees and establishing Palestine. Dave, can we click on to the next one? So, very quickly with this one, but I just wanted to talk about one of his most famous novellas that were written around about the same time, and it's called Men in the Sun, and it's available in English. It's, again, very accessible. And this is the story of three refugees, Abu Qais, Assad, and Marwan. And the three refugees have been affected by the Nakba. They are living in Jordan. They are going to Iraq to eventually get to Kuwait so that they can get a job because of the desperate economic circumstances in which they live in. But as they get to Basra, the problem is that they don't have enough money for the people smugglers. But luckily there is a truck driver, Abu Khazun, who says that he will take them in his truck, in his water tank, across the border and get them to Kuwait. So the story goes back and forward in each of the men's lives, and it tells them their story of the Nakba and what's happened to them. And it brings us to the story of their transport. And the first part of the transportation goes well until they get to the Kuwaiti border. And at the Kuwaiti border, Abu Khazun is taken in by the Kuwaiti border guards. He is held too long. The border guards start to poke fun at Abu Khazan, and Abu Khazan, they suggest is going between Basra and Kuwait because he has mistresses in both places. And this is particularly difficult for Abu Ghassan because in his personal story, you learn that he was castrated by a bomb during the Nakba as he was fighting. So at a personal level, that becomes a difficulty for him. And they hold him there, and outside in the baking heat of Kuwait, in the truck, are the 3 refugees. They eventually let Abu Ghassan out of their air-conditioned office. He rushes into the lorry. He drives as fast as he can. And spoiler alert, I think is what they say, but as he turns the corner, he screeches on the brakes. He goes to the truck, and the 3 men are dead. So the story goes on, and I won't give you all of the ending, but I think it's important that we understand that each of these, I think, tell their own story. So the 3 refugees tell the story of the Nakba and the Palestinians and the Palestinian voice, but for me, they continue to speak to the crisis of refugees today. Those who smuggle themselves in trucks compared to those who put themselves in danger by going across the Mediterranean. It's the same story. It's a timeless, unfortunately, it's a timeless story in that way. But there's something else. I think for Kanafani, Abu Ghassan is the impotent leader of the Palestinians who doesn't protect and can't fight for the Palestinian refugees. And the guards in the Kuwaiti border are the Arab leaders who do nothing to bring about Palestinian liberation and stand in the way of the Palestinians. And towards the end, it's left with Abu Ghassan asking a story, asking us all, why didn't they knock on the sides of the tank? Why didn't they bang on the sides of the tank? And part of the answer is, why didn't we hear the voice of the Palestinian refugees? Again, Dave, if we move on to the last but one slide. So up until now, Kanafani has been shaped by pan-Arabist politics, and he's been a member of the pan-Arabist Arab national movement. But there's something else that starts to happen. And what happens is that in 1965, there is the first of something called the Asifa Communication Number 1 is delivered. And that is a letter to the press in Lebanon announcing an armed campaign by a Palestinian group. That Palestinian group is Fatah, and they announced that they are coming onto the world in 1965. The campaign is not very significant in itself, but that is the first one. And Kanafani and George Habash are very, very critical of Fatah and taking up arms, because for them, the liberation will come through the Egyptian and the Syrian regimes, and that's the way forward, and so they're very critical. But in 1967, in the 6-Day War, the Israelis basically blow the pan-Arabist argument out the water, because in that 6 days, the Israelis defeat the Egyptians, they defeat the Jordanians, they defeat the Syrians, they take the Golan Heights, they take the West Bank, they take the Sinai, they take Gaza. And the notion that the powerful Arab armies would be able to liberate Palestine is really blown asunder. So it becomes a crisis, a political crisis. But in this political crisis, you have those arguing for armed resistance. And of course, there's a broader context to this. And the broader context is in 67, 68, you have had the liberation of Algeria, you've got the Vietnamese struggle, you've got the liberation of Cuba through the armed struggle there. And so there is an argument that takes place within Palestinian circles about, what is the way to liberation? If we can't rely on our Arab brothers and sisters in other countries, then we have to rely on ourselves. And in that sense, is it our own strength? Is it our own armed struggle that will take us forward? And then what happens in March 1968 becomes really important, because in March 1968 in Karama is a small village in central Jordan. Fatah, that's the forces that were around Yasser Arafat, and the PFLP are based in Karama. The PFLP is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which by 1968 has been formed by Kanafani and Habash out of the Arab National Movement. And they're in Karama, and the Jordanian regime comes to them and informs them that Israeli tanks and armed forces are amassing on the Jordanian border with the intention of wiping them out at Karama. The Jordanian regime advises that they remove themselves with some urgency, and they remove their troops from the area. The PFLP moved to the hills, and Fatah, under Yasser Arafat, say that they have had enough running away from the Israelis and they will not take one step back. The Israelis then send somewhere in the region of 20,000 troops against the Fadin in Karama. There are tanks, there are parachute regiments dropped into the hills where they engage battle with fighters from the PFLP. But the main assault is on Karama. And in Karama, Fatah hold their ground. It's full of all sorts of heroism. So there was 17 Palestinian fighters who just took on several tank forces themselves. Only one of them survived. One of the 17 at the end straps himself up with a bomb and throws himself at a tank in that way. And those 17 become known or become immortalized. And from that point onwards, Yasser Arafat had his own security force, and they were called Force 17 in recognition of those 17 people. But at the Battle of Karama, although they lost high numbers, the Palestinians did not take a step back. And in fact, the Israelis retreated. And it was a fantastic boost for those who wanted to argue that the way for Palestinian liberation was through the liberation struggle, and it boosted Fatah's position hugely. And over the next year, there were literally tens of thousands of people from the camps across the Arab world who flocked to join the various different organisations of what by 1969 became the PLO, as we more recently understood it. Under the control of Fatah, Fatah became the biggest organisation, but the PFLP became the second biggest organisation within the PLO umbrella. Now, Kanafani wasn't fighting in those things, but he did write two novels, and they mark a change in direction, I think. So first of all, in Return to Haifa, he tells the story of Said and Safiya, and of Ifra and Miriam, and their son Khaldun or Doi. So after 1967, those that had been captured, so those that were in the West Bank or in Gaza, were allowed to move inside what had been Palestine 48 in Israel. They weren't allowed to stay, but they were allowed to move. So this is the story of Said and Safiya, who had been ethnically cleansed from Haifa in 1948, but after 1967 were able to go back to their home. And they go back to their home, and the furniture's the same, the house is the same. And in their house is Ifra and Miriam. And so the story tells the stories of Said and Safiya during the Nakba, but also of Ifra and Miriam. And this is possibly the first story by a Palestinian which actually has a very positive story of Jewish settlers in Israel, because it's very understanding of Miriam and Ifra, who are refugees from Eastern Europe and who family had suffered atrocities during the Holocaust. So the story is a positive picture of them both, and it has Miriam drawing comparisons during the Nakba of her horror at how Israeli forces were treating Palestinians and the memories that invoked of how her brother was killed and treated by the Nazis in Poland. So that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is that Khaldun is Said and Safiya's son, but in the chaos of the cleansing, they lost their baby son. And in the aftermath, their baby son was brought up as Doi in this new home of Ifra and Miriam. So it's a complicated story, but I think there is something interesting about it, because after 1967, both the PFLP and Fatah moved to a much clearer position about what they were advocating, what they were fighting for. And what they were fighting for was a democratic, secular Palestine, a single state, a democratic, secular Palestine, where Jews and Muslims and Christians could live in equality and as one. And I think that's a story that attempts to talk about the possibilities here, because it's quite clear that what Kanafani says is that the problem effectively is not the Jews, it's not Ifra, it's not Miriam, it's the Zionists, it's the political philosophies of Zionism and the Israeli state that is at the heart of the problem. So it's quite an interesting story and grapples it in those contexts. And the next story, the Sad are a series of short stories called the Sad stories. Now, in Arabic means mother of, so is mother of Sad, and Sad is a freedom fighter, he's a Fadin. And so these short stories are stories about the Fadin and the growth of the resistance movements. But there are two types of heroes here for Kanafani. There are the heroes who pick up the guns and who go to fight for their liberation. But the second group of heroes are the Sads. It's the mothers, it's the communities within which those resistant fighters are grown, are born, and are supported. Because without the support of those communities, those freedom fighters and those camps simply couldn't exist. So there's two types of stories, and it's quite interesting that he moves in that direction. Final slide, Dave, if I may. So the book covers a number of other of his stories and novels. I've just given you a touch of those kind of things. But I want to think about what Kanafani's legacy is. And for me, he was a writer of short stories, novellas and novels, which continue to speak to the Palestinian experience, but continue to speak, I think, more generally about the experiences of refugees across the globe. He uses complex narrative structures, flashbacks, multiple narrators to bring the story of Palestine and Palestinian refugee to life. He was also an artist, a designer, an activist, a political spokesperson for the PFLP. But his life was brought to a shuddering halt on the 8th of July 1972 in Beirut, when he was going with his small niece to the shops to pick up some food. They got in the car, and as he turned on the engine, the bomb that Mossad had placed in that car blew up Ghassan and blew up his young niece alongside him. The intention of the Israelis was to shut Kanafani up, but I think through his novels, through the excerpts that you can see on YouTube, they completely and utterly failed to do that, and Kanafani and his words continue to speak to the Palestinian crisis today. And as the Lebanese Star said, who was Kanafani? Well, he was a commando from the PFLP, but he was a commando who never fired the gun and whose weapon was the ballpoint pen. And that's why he's one of the central characters in the story of the book, The Palestinian Cultures of Resistance, and someone who, if you haven't read his work, I would urge you to do so and get something from it. So Dave, that's over to you now. Dave, I can't hear you. Dave,
there you go. We had this conversation before that even after a year of doing these things, you still never remember to turn the mics on. I was just saying that there's a lot there to be thinking about, and as only one of the authors, artists that you cover in the book. But people, if they want, you can put your comments and questions in the chat. We can read them out, and I can put them to Michael. The book, in fact, is not yet, we don't yet have printed copies of it. We're talking about its long journey, but hopefully we should have by the end of next week, and you can order it from Bookmarks. A question I'd like to ask is about this role of poets and artists in the liberation struggle, or in Palestine specifically, because I've heard it said before that every Palestinian kid wants to be a doctor, a soldier, or a poet, and you know, so it plays a very important role there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, being separated in the diaspora and in the camps and so on, the question of a common identity is quite important. I have a friend, Wallace Sabit, who's from Tikrit, but was brought up in Haifa because his village, they were kicked out of their village in 48. And he's a rapper, a singer, the band 47 Soul. And, you know, whereas to us, being in a band, you know, is maybe about yourself. But it was very clear talking to Wala and to the others that they see their music and that is very much part of the struggle, is maintaining the identity, you know, about the dances, you know, all the different stuff. So I just thought if you could maybe say a wee bit more about that, like the role of culture in general and the role in the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah. So, I mean, we cover some of that in the book. So there's a chapter on what called literature of commitment. So in the Arab world called Adab Iltizam. And so there's a couple of things I think that's it's probably worth saying about that. I think all four of the artists that we cover during that period, there's a real emphasis on producing an accessible art form. So if you look in the Arab world, the highest cultural form, I think, is probably the poem, the long poem. But they were, you know, very formalistic and very formal way of writing, very complex way of writing as well. But the movement for literature commitment basically argued that it had to be much more accessible. It had to use much more common symbols, easier and accessible language, so that it could be reproduced by ordinary people in that way. And by doing so, it became a vehicle of telling the story of refugees or making political points. It's interesting, you know, at Palestinian funerals, poetry reading and various cultural elements sometimes play a part. It's not unusual to have people dancing the dabka at a funeral, and in fact, for a while, funeral processions were almost treated like wedding processions, because the martyr was going back to their beloved, which was Palestine. And there was a sort of celebration of their life and the life of a fighter. So those cultural elements, the traditional songs, the modern poems, the dancing the dabka, the Palestinian music, are all part and parcel of reclaiming and holding on to who we are. The other thing I think about that is that you know, especially from Britain, you know, poets in particular or key writers, they're not celebrated in the way that they are in, particularly I think in colonized parts of the world. You know, amongst the oppressed and the colonized, then your writers, your poets, your singers become symbols of the nation and your national liberation struggle. So they have a much more significant role and place to play. When Mahmoud, when Darwish died, there was 3 days of mourning, and there was tens of thousands of people who came to Ramallah, you know, to mark his funeral and all the rest of it. So if you think about maybe not a poet, but you know, a poet or a novelist or you know, that's not really going to happen in Britain in the same way. So I think there's those cultural aspects of those things there. The other thing I think it's also worth mentioning, I think, is that there's also a tradition in Islamic traditions of the Hafiz, you know, the person who can recite the Quran. So recitation of quite long pieces, either of the Quran or of poetry, is something that becomes important, and particularly within the Palestinian communities within Palestine 48, after the Nakba, there were very few outlets for them to write Arabic publications. And so recitation of poetry, and therefore accessible poetry that people could recite and take from village to village as part of reclaiming our identity, became very significant as well. So I think those are some of the key elements I think about thinking about Palestinian culture. And of course, it's not static. So you're right. You know, now we have Palestinian rappers, and I think it's quite interesting the way in which the Palestinian dances have been sort of recreated. So there's, again, on YouTube, there's a really wonderful clip, quite scary clip in some ways, about the Great March of Return in Gaza, where there's people doing the dabka if we're round about them, there is Israelis shooting them and there's gas bombs going off, and yet they're still defiantly doing the Dabzam. And you think, well, you know, I'd like to think I was brave enough to do that, but I'm not quite sure that I would be. You know, it's so no, and I think that sort of the traditional has been brought up to date and embedded within the resistance movement.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you said about accessibility. And in case anybody's not noticed, there are two people from Scotland here, but the 784 company and John McGrath, we were very popular in the 70s in Scotland when there was a big movement. Also very much talked about using forums that could be accessible to people. So they used dance forums as well, the Cayley forum and so on. So, I mean, I think if anybody's going to read the novels of Kanafani, you will notice, as you mentioned, that they can be time jumps, it can go flashbacks, you know, in a way they're not disjointed, but broken up in a way that reflects the reality of Palestinian society, you know, dispersed, broken up, time, it can stand still and come back again, and so on. But there's a couple of questions in the chat here that we might go into. Masood Kamali there says he's a question for Michael. What do you think about what he said about the negotiations between the sword and the neck? And of course, that is, in fact, very, very relevant down to this day to day where we have, you know, the ceasefire. And you might ask all those questions again or give all those answers. What ceasefire? Whose ceasefire? What peace? So I suppose what we're saying is this is still existing. I mean, do you agree with that, Michael? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastically vivid analogy that he uses, that, you know, that the kind of negotiations that are being promoted by the international community and by the Israelis are exactly that. They are the negotiations between the sword and the neck. So they call for the capitulation of the Palestinians. And what Kanafani was saying is that we shouldn't engage in those kind of negotiations, that the Palestinians had to liberate themselves as the process of liberating for, in his terms, for a democratic secular Palestine. And that's something that the Israeli state, in his terms, were never ever going to give up or negotiate to give up. So it needed to be a more militant struggle for those rights. And that's the point I think that the Kanafani is making, that those who argue for those negotiations, that want to bring the organisations, are there to incorporate the organisations themselves, but to deflect the Palestinian struggle away from their national liberation demands.
Mm-hmm. You also talked about the development of ideas in the national movement through, you know, Pan-Arabism, and then moving on to Fatah and you know, the direct struggle. But of course, they themselves those ideas were also replaced, you know, by Hamas and so on. So within the people that you discuss in the book, do you think, is this development evident in their work?
So I think, so again, for trying to pick the four authors, I mean, obviously, Kanafani is murdered in 72, so he doesn't have a great deal to say later on. But through Darwish, the poetry of Darwish takes us through that story as it moves on. So we have then the siege of Beirut and what happens to the Palestinian fighters in Beirut after that, and Darwish talks about those things. So we talk about that in the book there. After the defeat in Lebanon, excuse me. After the defeat in Lebanon, the Palestinian fighters were scattered across the Arab world. And of course, one of the consequences of that was that as the PLO, under various promises from the American state, so here's your sword and your neck, the American state promised that the Palestinian refugees would be protected in Beirut. The Palestinian fighters left Beirut, and under the protection of the Israelis, the Lebanese phalange moved into Shabra and Shatila and massacred hundreds of people in those refugee camps. So there's you know, if you negotiate, that's what it ends up with. But of course, the scattering of the Palestinian forces in that major defeat in Beirut in the mid-1980s marked another shift. And this time the shift came from inside Palestine 48, and the first Intifada really was quite different. The first Intifada wasn't a military campaign, it wasn't a military uprising, it was a mass movement of ordinary Palestinians. It was strikes, it was mass demonstrations. They set up their own schools, they set up their own welfare networks. Many of those are still residually there in the refugee camps across the West Bank today, and it was a huge challenge to the Israelis. The Israelis responded, as you might expect, incredibly brutally with an iron fist, but it did raise a huge problem for Israel, and that led to negotiations, again, between the sword and the neck, because what it gave us was the Oslo Accords and the promise of an eventual two-state solution, which has never come to pass, and the canonization of the West Bank and the growth of settlements is what eventually happened. But the promise was that because of the Intifada, the mass movement, something else would happen, and it didn't. The interesting thing, of course, again, is that the involvement of Palestinians from within Israel after the first Intifada declined, but we're now seeing that burst back onto the scene in a way which we haven't really seen since the 1980s. The second Intifada was really quite different. It wasn't a mass movement, it was a much more militarized campaign on both sides, and it didn't really have the same kind of impact inside Israel itself. So, of course, the politics has moved on, and in a sense, the cultural aspects are sort of time limited in a sense, in that I'm looking at what happened in that high point of national resistance literature between '68 and the start of the Oslo Accords. But Naji Alali, his cartoons were key during the first Intifada, and actually, if you look anywhere across the Arab world where ordinary people rise up against their rulers, you will find Handala. In Egypt, Handala was there. Across the Arab Spring, Handala was there. He has become a generalized symbol of the poor and the oppressed across the Middle East, rising up against their rulers and against imperialism. Fadwa Tolkien was still writing poems during the second Intifada. The interesting story about Fadwa was that she started off in a quite middle-class Palestinian family, facing all the restrictions of being a woman in that layer of Palestinian society. As she broke with her family and embraced the national liberation struggle, she becomes a symbol of a feminist aesthetic. But the irony is that towards the end of her life, she is confined in her home again, but not by the restrictions of Palestinian society, but by the curfew that the Israelis imposed on Nablus in the second Intifada. So there's a story there about the drifting, about the shifting politics, and the book tries to cover the assault in Beirut, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, and Fadwa Tolkien, and we touch on all these elements and the impact they have on the four cultural figures.
Right. Okay. We've kind of talked for about an hour now, Michael. Do you think we should show the John Berger letter? I think we should.
I think we should. If people don't want to watch it, they can turn off or whatever. Yeah, but exactly. If I could just say that this is from 2008, and it was a recording that John Berger made for a Palestinian art exhibition. And it runs for about 14 minutes, and he reads the whole of Letter to Gaza. And for those that like John Berger, it's a wonderful chance to see John Berger performing this. But it's also quite stressful because the story itself is, has got a particular resonance today in terms of what we think of what's happening to the children of Gaza today. And it's also, I think, traumatic in the sense that you can see John Berger getting affected by the story as it unfolds. So it's a beautiful rendition and a beautiful reading, and it might be a nice way to finish the event if we just put this on and let it run through, and then we can come back to you at the end.
Right.
Okay, so let me try and do this. This is where we might get a bit sticky, but let me try this. So
if it doesn't work, I have already put the link in the chat there, so people will be able to watch it.
Okay.
So it would be good to have it in this.
So I think I've got it. Can you see that, Dave? It's
yeah, there you go.
Here we go.
Dear Mustafa, I have now received your letter in which you tell me that you've done everything necessary to enable me to stay with you in Sacramento. I've also received news that I have been accepted in the Department of Civil Engineering in the University of California. I must thank you for everything, my friend. But it will strike you as rather odd when I proclaim this news to you. But make no doubt about it. I feel no hesitation at all. In fact, I'm pretty positive that I have never seen things so clearly as I do now. No, my friend, I've changed my mind. I won't follow you to the land where there is greenery, water, and lovely faces, as you wrote in your last letter. No, I'll stay here, and I won't ever leave. I'm really upset that our lives won't continue to follow the same course, Mustafa. For I can almost hear you reminding me of our vow to go on together, and then of the way we used to shout, "We'll get rich." But there's nothing I can do, my friend. Yeah, I still remember the day when I stood in the hall of Cairo Airport, pressing your hand and staring at the frenzied motor of the plane. And at that moment, everything was rotating in time with the ear-splitting noise of the motor. And you stood in front of me, your round face silent. Your face hadn't changed from the way it used to be when you were growing up in the Shia quarter of Gaza, apart from a few wrinkles. We grew up together, understanding each other completely, huh? And we promised to go on to the end. But there's a quarter of an hour now, a quarter of an hour left before the plane takes off. Don't look into space like that. Listen. You'll go to Kuwait next year, and you'll save enough from your salary to uproot you from Gaza and transplant you to California. We started off together, and we must carry on. I hear you saying that to me. I hear you. And at that moment, I was watching your rapidly moving lips, yet in an obscure way, I felt that you were not completely happy with your flight. You couldn't give 3 good reasons for it. The Ministry of Education in Kuwait had given you a contract, though it hadn't given me one. Later, in the trough of misery where I existed, you sent me small sums of money. And you knew my family's circumstances. You knew them in and out. You knew that my meager salary in the UNRWA school was inadequate to support my mother, my brother's widow, and her 4 children. Listen carefully, write to me every day, every hour, every minute. Look, the plane's just leaving. Goodbye. Or rather, till we meet again. Later, the Ministry of Education in Kuwait gave me a contract. My life there had a gluey, vacuous quality, as though I were a small oyster lost in oppressive loneliness. There was a slipperiness to my whole life. It was only a hankering for the end of each month. And in the middle of that year, the Jews bombarded the central district of Sabha and attacked Gaza, our Gaza, with bombs and flamethrowers. I was going to leave this Gaza, leave it behind me, and go to California, where I would live for myself, my own self, which had suffered for so long. I hated Gaza and its inhabitants. Everything in the amputated town reminded me of failed pictures. painted in grey by a sick man. Yes, of course, I'd send my mother and my brother's widow and her children a meagre sum to help them to live. But I would liberate myself from even this last tie too, there in green California, far from the reek of defeat, which for 7 long years had filled my nostrils. You know these feelings because you've really experienced them. What is this ill-defined tie we had with Gaza, which nevertheless blunted our enthusiasm for flight? Why didn't we analyze the matter in such a way as to see its clear meaning? When I went on holiday in June and assembled all my possessions, longing for the sweet departure, the start towards those little things which give life a nice bright meaning, I found Gaza, just as I had known it, was more cramped than the mind of a sleeper in the throes of a fearful nightmare. These narrow streets, which had their bulging balconies, this Gaza. Yet what are the obscure causes that draw a man to his family, his house, his memories, like a spring draws a small flock of mountain goats? I don't know. All I know is that I went to my mother's house that morning. And when I arrived, my late brother's wife met me and asked me, she was weeping, if I would do as her wounded daughter Nadia, now in Gaza hospital, wished me to do, and visit her that evening. Mustafa, do you know Nadia, my brother's beautiful 13-year-old daughter? That evening, I bought a pound of apples and set out for the hospital to visit Nadia. I knew that there was something about it that my mother and my sister-in-law were hiding from me. I loved Nadia. I loved her from habit, the same habit that made me love all that generation, which had been so brought up on defeat and displacement that it had come to think that a happy life was a kind of social deviation. I entered the white room very calm. Ill children have something of saintliness, and how much more so if the child is ill as a result of cruel, painful wounds. Nadia was lying on her bed, her back propped up on a pillow, over which her hair was spread like a thick belt. There was a profound silence in her wide eyes, and a tear always shining in the depths of her black pupils. Her face was calm and still, but eloquent, as the face of a tortured prophet might be. And Nadia was still a child, but she seemed more than a child, much more, and older than a child, much older. Nadia, I've no idea whether I was the one who said it, or whether it was someone else behind me, but she raised her eyes to me, and I felt them dissolve me like a piece of sugar that has fallen into a hot cup of tea. And together with her slight smile, I heard her voice. Uncle, have you just come from Kuwait? Then her voice broke in her throat, and she raised herself with the help of her hands and stretched out her neck towards me. I patted her back and sat down near her. Nadia, look, I brought you presents from Kuwait, lots of presents. I'll wait till you can leave your bed, completely well and healed, and then you'll come to my house, and I'll give them to you. I bought you the red trousers you wrote and asked me for. Yes, I bought them. It was a lie, born of the tense situation. But as I uttered it, I felt that I was speaking the truth for the first time. Nadia trembled, as though she had had an electric shock, and lowered her head in a terrible silence. I felt her tears wetting the back of my hand. Say something, Nadia, say something. Don't you want the red trousers? She lifted her gaze to me and made as if to speak, but then she stopped, gritted her teeth, and I heard her voice again, coming from far away. Uncle. She stretched out her hand, lifted the white coverlet with her fingers, and pointed to her leg, amputated from the top of the thigh. I went out of the hospital in Gaza that day. The blazing sun filled the streets with the color of blood. And Gaza was brand new, Mustafa. You and I never saw it like this. The stones piled up at the beginning of the Shahia quarter, where we lived, had a meaning. This Gaza in which we had lived, and with whose good people we had spent 7 years of defeat, was something new. It seemed to me just a beginning. I don't know why I thought it was just a beginning. I imagined that the main street that I walked along on the way back home, I imagined it was only the beginning of a long, long, long road leading to Safad. Everything in this Gaza fogged with sadness, which was not confined to weeping. It was a challenge. More than that, it was something like reclamation of the amputated leg. I went out into the streets of Gaza, streets filled with blinding sunlight. And they told me that Nadia had lost her leg when she threw herself on top of her little brothers and sisters to protect them from the bombs and flames that had fastened their claws into the house. Nadia could have saved herself. She could have got out, run away, rescued her leg, but she didn't. Why? No, my friend, I won't come to Sacramento and have no regrets. No. And nor will I finish what we began together in childhood. That obscure feeling that you had as you left Gaza, that small feeling must grow into a giant one deep within you. It must expand. You must seek it in order to find yourself here among the ugly debris of defeat. I won't come to you, but you return to us. Come back to learn from Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh, what life is and what existence is worth. Come back, my friend. We're all waiting for you.
So,
extremely powerful indeed there, and great to see John Berger reading. Well, of course, struggle goes on, so the debris of, not necessarily of defeat, but the debris is still there in Palestine, in Gaza. One of the things that we are keen to support in Bookmarks, the bookshop, is of course the fund for the Samir Mansour bookshop that was blown up by the Israelis a couple of days ago. So I put the link in the chat for that. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Michael for his excellent presentation. The book will be available from Bookmarks, bookmarksbookshop.co.uk. You can email us, or you can ring the shop, and we'll send them out to you. So that's really all for tonight. And next week, I think we have a meeting on the David Constantine, the writer, is talking about the Paris Commune and a new short story he's written. So hope to see you again next week. Thank you once again to Michael, and good night, everybody.
good night.